20 billion in GDP, 5 billion on the table. One page buried deep on line 186. As cameras rolled, President Ibrahim Traoré paused, penning humped, eyes narrowed. Was this really a mining deal, or the quiet handover of an entire nation's oil? The clause was hidden. The consequences global. What would you do if one signature could sell your country's soul? He didn't blink. He didn't sign. What followed shook boardrooms in Paris, summit halls in Beijing, and dinner tables across Africa. This is the story they never expected you to hear. Stay with us. Subscribe and witness what happens when a man refuses to bow. It should have been the moment of celebration. Months of negotiations, dozens of press releases, flags of China and Burkina Faso hanging side by side. In the summit chamber, international media packed shoulder-to-shoulder cameras already, broadcasting to the world. Everyone expected one thing. A signature President Traoré dressed in full military attire sat at the polished mahogany table across from him. Li Jiang, chairman of Tanzan Earth Holdings, exuded corporate charm. His black suit shimmered slightly under the spotlights. Today marks a new era of prosperity for many Bakrit. Burkina Faso. Li had declared minutes earlier, his tone warm but calculated. But as Troy's hand reached for the pen, he gave the contract one last look. Just a glance. One more scan out of instinct. That's when his eyes caught it. A single line. Page 186. It was buried beneath layers of joint security protocols. Innocuous at first glance, but the language shifted suddenly. Trai's jaw clenched. The clause referenced not only full Chinese operational oversight over the rare earth sites, but also legal pathways to absorb adjacent oil reserves within the shared economic zone for the protection of bilateral energy interests. He flipped back 3 pages, then forward again. It was deliberate, not a misprint, not an oversight. Traoré's voice broke through the room, low and steady. Mr. Li, this clause. He tapped the page. It gives your company exclusive exploration and security rights over all resources within a 75-kilometer radius of the mining zone, including crude oil fields. Li shifted in his chair. Mr. President, that's standard perimeter security to ensure protection of infrastructure protection. Traoré repeated. Or Kiat ownership? His ministers were silent. Some looked confused. Others avoided his gaze. Traoré stood up. He didn't raise his voice, but each word sliced like a blade. You offered us investment. What you handed us was submission. Mr. President, you misunderstand? No, I understand perfectly. The French tried this with gold. Now you try with rare earths and oil. Different tongue, same chains. A sudden shuffle from the press. Zone cameras zoomed in. One journalist gasped aloud. Page 186. Traoré said, holding up the contract is the price tag on our sovereignty, finance. Minister Doumbia wiped sweat from his brow. His hands trembled. Fatima Coulibaly, the president's translator, stepped quietly to his side and whispered, "We warned them. They thought you wouldn't find it." The tycoon's expression hardened. "You turn away billions. Mr. President, your nation needs this." Tro leaned forward. "We need partners, not new landlords." And with that, he placed the pen on the table, not on the paper. The room erupted, not in cheers, but in disbelief. Ministers whispered. Chinese executives stood up. One slammed a briefcase shut, but Traoré was already walking away. He didn't need more time. He needed no translator. He had seen enough, and he had made his choice. Burkina Faso would stand free, even if it meant standing alone. It was supposed to be just dinner, a gesture of diplomacy, nothing more. A quiet evening at the presidential residence in Hagadu, 3 weeks before the summit. No cameras, no speeches, just President Ibrahim Traoré and Li Jiang, CEO of Tanzan Earth Holdings, sitting across from each other over grilled guinea fowl, millet, couscous, and hibiscus tea. At first, the Conversation was light. Lee praised Burkina Faso's progress, complimented the infrastructure plans, and offered his vision for what he called a shared prosperity. Trio listened politely, nodding where appropriate. He had hosted many such dinners before. Western, Eastern, Arab, African. The tone was always the same: charm, ambition, reassurance. But something about Lee was different. His calm was too calculated. His eyes didn't wander like a curious guest. They measured it was during the second course, just after a polite toast, that Lee leaned back and smiled. "Mr. President," he said, swirling his glass, "what your country holds beneath, Isual, it's not just wealth, it's legacy. Rare earths are forever." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. Traore narrowed his eyes slightly. He didn't respond immediately. He looked instead to Fatima Coulibaly, his trusted translator and advisor, who sat quietly nearby. She didn't react either, but he saw it. The brief flicker in her eyes, the subtle shift in her posture. She had caught something. Later that night, after Li Jiang had been escorted back to his hotel, and the staff had cleared the last dish, Charan Fatima, standing alone in the hall, arms folded, brows furrowed. "What did he really say?" he asked. "No pretensin," his voice. She took a moment before responding. The term he used in Mandarin wasn't the usual word for forever. Sire. It was more specific. It's used when referring to inheritance or permanent custodianship, like something passed down through generations. Not a lease. Triel's jaw tightened. "Permanent claim." Fatima nodded. "That's what it implied." He said nothing at first, just walked slowly toward the window, hands behind his back. Outside, the lights of Ouagadougou flickered in soft rose. The capital slept unaware, but inside, something had shifted. "How many people speak Mandarin in our cabinet?" he asked finally. "Fluently," she replied. "2, maybe 3, including me." "So, they think we won't know," he said softly. She stepped closer. "Sir, there's more. I've been reviewing the Mandarin drafts and comparing them to the French versions. Some section don't align. Security terms, ownership language, nothing overt, just enough to shift, meaning without notice." Chor turned sharply. "Why didn't you say anything?" Needed more time," she replied. "I didn't want to raise false alarms, but after tonight, I'm sure." He nodded once. Firmly, "No more dinners. No more courtesy. I want a full review of every clause in that contract, both versions, quietly, and I want to know who in our cabinet has been pushing this deal too hard." She hesitated. "You think someone's been bought?" "I think," he said, "someone's already sold us." That night, Charara didn't sleep. He sat at his desk under the soft light of a desk lamp, flipping through the French version of the agreement. Every line that once looked like opportunity, now read like a warning. Investment in infrastructure, but only through Chinese contractors. Technology transfer, but without sovereign oversight. Employment, guarantees, but vague limits on local workforce quotas. He scribbled notes in the margins, circled terms, cross-referenced timelines. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he recalled the fate of President Audro from decades before, who had signed away mining rights for a fraction of their value, only to be forced out when the people discovered what he had done. It would not happen again, not on his watch. The next morning, Traore summoned his head of military intelligence, Colonel Bako, and ordered a parallel investigation into the land survey zones and the rumored arrival of Chinese security specialists at the border. "Don't alert anyone in the place." "Cabinet," he instructed. "Not yet." Bako looked confused. "Are we under threat?" "Not from weapons," Trio said. "From contracts." In the days that followed, Fatima worked around the clock, cross-checking every line of the agreement with the help of 2 young analysts she trusted. What they found confirmed the worst. Discrepancies between the versions were systematic: rights over undiscovered oil fields, security access zones overlapping with military bases, and one clause marked simply C. Page 186, for emergency sovereignty arrangements. That page would change everything. And the smile Li Jiang gave at dinner, it didn't fit because it wasn't a smile. It was a signal. The night was long and the room was still. A single desk lamp cast a pool of yellow light onto President Traoré's polished wooden desk, where a thick stack of papers sat like a loaded weapon. 200 pages of dense legal text, headers bolded, footnotes crammed, margins narrow. But it was page 186 that held his attention like a ticking bomb. He'd read this contract before twice. So had his advisors, but not like this. Not with suspicion in his blood and betrayal in the air. Not after Fatima's warning about mistranslations, and not after Li Jiang's cryptic remark. That page now held a weight he hadn't noticed before. He leaned forward, tracing his finger over the clause buried halfway down the page. It referenced Appendix 4C, Emergency Sovereignty Protocols. That section hadn't been emphasized in any briefing. In fact, it hadn't even been printed in the standard French translation. Only the Mandarin draft had flagged it. His jaw clenched. Someone had buried it deliberately. He reached for the prive annexes. Appendix 4C was near the back, printed in smaller font than the rest, like it didn't want to be noticed. And there in the third paragraph was the line that stopped his breath. In order to ensure uninterrupted rare earth production in priority economic zones, the investor shall retain autonomous security and operational jurisdiction within a 60-kilometer radius of all extraction sites defined as resource guardianship rights. He read it again, slowly, then a third time. Autonomous security and operational jurisdiction, that wasn't protection, that was control. Jurisdiction meant legal authority. Autonomous meant without oversight, and 60 kilon, that was no perimeter. That was a territory, a shadow government. He flipped to the reference map. The proposed sites, rare earth extraction. 4 of them were strategically placed near key oil reserves, national highways, and 2 military training camps. If these rights went into effect, Tangian Earth Holdings would command de facto zones that wrapped around Burkina Faso's most sensitive infrastructure. It was conquest without a single shot fired. He grabbed a red pen and circled the phrase, resource guardianship rights. Then he underlined 60 colomb. Then he drew a line down to the bottom margin and wrote 2 words in capital letters. Note défensible. A knock came at the door. It was nearly 1 kilometer. Fatima entered, holding her own stack of papers. She looked exhausted, but sharp. We found the Mandarin version of Appendix 4C. The language is even stronger there, she said, placing her copy on his desk. They use the term Zukuandu. It means sovereign zone. He stared at her. You sure? I double-checked with an independent linguist in Da. Same conclusion. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. They wrote sovereignty into a corporate contract. She nodded and made sure most of our people couldn't read it. He looked down at the text again, his mind racing. This wasn't just a legal trick. It was a blueprint for soft colonization. Give a company operational authority over land. Insert lightly armed security forces. Call them industrial protectors. And when the population resists, frame it as sabotage. Justify enforcement. It was clever and dangerous. What do you think of Traoré's response so far? Drop your thoughts below and comment amen if you stand with him. We need to know how this got past our review teams. He said, I've already started tracing the edits. She replied, Appendix 4C was added in revision 7. That version was only circulated in Mandarin. The French version stops at Appendix 3. And who approved revision 7? She hesitated. The Ministry of Strategic Resources under Minister Dio. His expression darkened. He remembered how Dio had been pushing the deal at every turn, saying the Chinese were being generous, claiming the legal structure was just a formality, urging fast approval before the summit. Traoré stood and walked to the large map of Burkina Faso pinned on the wall. He placed a red marker on each of the 4 mining sites. Then he drew a compass circle around each one. 60 kilometer in every direction. The result made his stomach turn. The zones touched major population centers. They overlapped with military outposts. One came dangerously close to Ging, the central oil pipeline junction. This was never about rare earths, he murmured. This was about territory, Fatima said quietly, and replacing France with a quieter occupier, he turned sharply. Not under my watch. At that moment, his phone buzzed. A secure line from Colonel Bayo. Mr. President, the colonel said, voice urgent. Chinese logistical teams have already requested land surveys near Bobo Diosso. They claim it's for housing engineers, but their maps match military coordinates. How long have they been doing this? 2 weeks. Quietly through a private security firm, registered in Nairobi. Pull their licenses. Freeze everything. Effective. Immediately. Yes, sire. He hung up and looked again at the contract. So, this was it. The plan wasn't just to extract minerals. It was to rewrite borders, using ink and lies. The sun had barely risen when Fatima knocked on the presidential office door, her knuckles sharp, her expression unreadable. President Traore, still in uniform from a sleepless night, waved her in without looking up. Papers lit at his desk, red ink covering paragraphs like a battlefield. He was already deep into preparing the list of ministries that would need immediate audits, but the urgency in her eyes stopped him cold. She stepped forward, placed a small flash drive on his desk, and said, Sir, I have something you need to hear. He paused. What is it? Proof of everything. A moment passed between them. Then he nodded once and inserted the drive into his encrypted laptop. As the first file played, Fatima folded her hands behind her back and stared at the wall, unwilling to look directly at her president as betrayal poured through the speakers. The voice was unmistakably Chinese, deep and deliberate. It belonged to one of Tianjin Earth Holdings' top legal advisors. He was speaking in Mandarin, and Fatima had translated every word. The wording is key. We don't say ownership. We say resource guardianship. Let the French text suggest temporary access, but the Mandarin version, it makes the rights indefinite. The contract auto-renews. Under emergency conditions, we define, this isn't a deal. It's a quiet transfer of sovereignty. Trio's face darkened. The next voice was Li Jiang himself. Once the first phase is signed, Li said, our security personnel will establish bases around the oil basins, the Burkina Faso. Authorities won't be able to override operational control. Their ministers are already on board. Minister Dio and Minister Nani have expedited the review process. A few well-placed incentives go a long way. Incentives. Triallo clenched his fist. Fatima finally spoke. These recordings were taken at the executive lounge of the TA Hotel. I posed as a translator for the Mandarin, speaking guests at the investment roundtable. They didn't know I understood everything. They spoke freely. He turned to her slowly. And the ministers, I traced financial activity through secondary accounts, offshore deposits, quiet property purchases in Ghana. Minister Dio received over $850 Ling in 3 months. Minister Nani closer to $1, 4 million, both routed through consulting fees for strategic advisory services. Traore rose from his chair. You're telling me they sold us out for the price of a waterfront villa? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The recordings continued. More voix, more details. Discussions of resource corridors and deep access zones. One executive joked about how this time we won't need soldiers to take the land. Another laughed. Their leaders will sign the surrender themselves. He slammed the laptop shut. The room went silent. Outside, the morning was breaking. Birds chirped. The palace staff had begun their routines, but inside, the president's heart was pounding like a war drum. How many people know what you've uncovered? He asked her. Only why? And 2 tech assistants who believe in this country enough to stay silent, she replied. He looked at her steady. Good. We'll keep it that way for now. He began pacing. We need to act fast. If Li Jiang's senses were onto them, they'll pull back or disappear the evidence. And if Minister Dio or Minister Nan get wind of this, they'll try to cover their tracks. Fatima stepped forward. Sir, there's more. The Chinese aren't planning to hire local workers for phase 1. I intercepted an internal memo. Wu, Ling, Chinese workers already approved for relocation under infrastructure support visas. They're bringing their own population to operate the sites. Our people would be left with cleanup jobs. So, it wasn't just the theft of land. It was a replacement of labor, of agency, of the future. We'll need to isolate Dio and Nyan immediately. Complies. Traore said, freeze there, access to internal systems, lock down their staff. And the summit, she asked. He stared into the distance. The world thinks we're going to sign that contract live on television. Are you going to cancel? No, he said, slowly. I'm going to sign something else. She raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I'm going to sign the moment they lose their grip, right there on camera. He walked to the window and looked out over the capital, now bathed in gold morning light. This country has been broken and stitched back together too many times by colonizers, by corrupt leaders, by smiling men with contracts thicker than their conscience. He turned back to her, but not today. Fatima nodded. Then Traore walked over to the map again. He marked the zones in red. The area is now effectively compromised, one site after another, overlapping, spreading, crawling. It was never about mining. It was about position, leverage, power. They waited for the world to look the other way. He said mostly to himself, and they almost succeeded. Sagna spoke quietly behind him. Sir, we'll need to go public eventually. Our people deserve to know what's being done in their name. I know, T replied, but not yet. Not until we have everything, the recordings, the permits, the satellite proof. Then we go to the summit, and not only do we refuse to sign, he turned to Sagner, eyes cold with purpose. We expose it, all of it. Live. The general gave a rare smile. Then I suggest we prepare for the world to finally hear what Africa sounds like when it says no. As he left the room, Traore turned back to the map one last time. Wu, Nul men were coming, but they wouldn't find a country asleep. They'd find a nation standing tall, eyes open, and ready. The ceremonial stage was dressed in confidence, flags aligned, polished podiums glinting under perfect lights, and delegates from over 30 nations seated in neat rows with earpieces and tight smiles. The deal was supposed to be historic, a model for Africa-Asia cooperation. As the host called it, the national anthem had played, a school choir had sung, a video montage had shown projections of highways, hospitals, and thousands of jobs. But the room wasn't watching the screens anymore. All eyes were locked on President Ibrahim Traoré. He stood behind a long mahogany table, thumbing through the final copy of the investment agreement with deliberate calm. Next to him, Lai Jiang of Tanjin, Earth Holdings, sat with his team, pens ready, cameras trained on their hands. Behind them, banners displayed phrases like shared, future, strategic growth, and trust in action. The crowd expected a signature. Instead, they got silence. Trio's fingers stopped moving. Page 186. Again, he had already memorized it. But now, with the weight of global attention on his shoulders, he let the moment settle. He looked up. Then he closed the contract softly. The microphones picked up the soft thud. His voice came next. Low, but steady. There is a line, he said, where cooperation ends and surrender begins. I believe that line is printed on page 186. A murmur spread through the audience. The journalists in the media bay leaned forward. Li Jiang smiled awkwardly. Mr. President, if there's a detail you'd like clarified, I'm sure our legal team. Traore raised a hand, silencing him. Then he lifted the contract with one hand, page marked. I want to read something, he said, directly in your words. He flipped the page open and read slowly into the microphone. In the interest of protecting the stability of investment operations, The investing party shall be granted autonomous security and operational jurisdiction within a 60-kilometer of radius of each designated resource corridor, including but not limited to existing or future hydrocarbon reserves, mineral sites, and infrastructural arteries. These rights shall remain in force during the full term of the BITE agreement and shall auto-renew under conditions deemed emergent by the investing party. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Journalists began typing furiously. Even a few ministers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Let me repeat, Traore continued. Auto-renew under conditions deemed emergent by the PLASH-TCT investing party. That means you, not us. Decide when this ends. Li Jiang leaned into his mic, trying to sound calm. Mr. President, legal language can sometimes be complex. That clause is standard in large-scale infrastructure deals. Then why? Tro asked, his voice rising just slightly. Was it written only in the Mandarin version of the contract and excluded from the official French translation submitted to our parliament? Li Jiang faltered. His translator whispered urgently in his ear, "We are open to amending language." No, Tro said flatly. This is not a misprint. It is not a misunderstanding. It is a trap. Quiet, legal, and deadly. Li Jiang's charm dropped. He adjusted his tie, his jaw tense. You're accusing us of deception. Traore didn't blink. I'm accusing you of thinking we wouldn't read past the promises. He turned to the crowd. My people have lived through too many signatures that took more than they gave. We've seen contracts that smiled in the light and strangled us in the dark. The hall fell still. Even the translator booth went quiet. On screen, the contract's page 186 was now projected behind him in bold red letters. Traore had underlined 3 phrases: autonomous jurisdiction, resource corridors, and auto-renew. Do you know, he said, looking at no one in particular, how many of our military outposts fall within these so-called corridors? How many towns, how many oil basins we haven't even tapped yet? He looked back at Li Jiang. You wanted us to sign away our future politely, on camera, with ribbon and ceremony. Li Jiang's voice lost its polish. We came here in good faith. We brought $5 billion. Traore nodded. And you nearly bought a country. He placed the contract down and stood taller. But Burkina Faso is not for sale. Not to China. Not to anyone. The silence afterward was heavier than any explosion. Then the cameras started flashing. Reporters shouting. Questions. Aides rushing to adjust microphones. Li Jiang turned to his advisors, clearly rattled. His translator began fielding urgent calls behind him. A Tangian Earth Holdings executive stood up and walked out, already on the phone. The deal, once moments from conclusion, now hung dead in the air like smoke after a fire. Traore stepped away from the table and nodded to his security team. This ceremony is over. He walked off stage as murmurs grew into chaos. He didn't look back. As President Traore stepped off the summit stage, a wave of silence followed him down the corridor. No music, no applause, only the muffled sounds of frantic whispers behind closed doors. His steps were slow but deliberate, the contract still clutched in his hand like evidence from a crime scene. He didn't stop to greet anyone. He didn't acknowledge the aides trailing behind him. The moment he reached the private conference room, he turned to his security chief. Where are they? He asked. The chief answered instantly. Finance Minister Dio is in the press wing. Oil Minister Nan is still in the green room, waiting for your closing statement. Traore looked at him, voice calm. Place them both under immediate house arrest. No warning. Seize their phones, tablets, all communication. Secure their staff. The chief hesitated. On what grounds? Sire. Trey handed him a folder, copies of bank transfers, false invoice, property deeds in Ghana, all linked to shell companies tracing back to Chinese subsidiaries. Start with corruption and treason. We'll build the rest later. The chief nodded and disappeared. Within 15 minutes, 2 black SUVs rolled up to the side entrance of the summit hall. No lights, no sirens, just quiet authority. Dio never saw it coming. He was mid-con conversation with a BBC correspondent when two officers approached and asked him to step outside. When he resisted, one handed him a sealed presidential order. The color drained from his face. In the green room, Minister Nan was sipping tea, unaware of the chaos unraveling outside. He chuckled to himself as he scrolled headlines in anticipation of a global media blitz. He didn't look up until three men in uniform entered, flanked by legal officials. The lead officer presented him a warrant. The moment he read the charge, his hand began to shake. Does the president know about this? He are close. Asked, voice dry. He signed the order himself. Both men were quietly removed from the summit without a word to the public. But the story was already slipping from the shadows. A journaliste from Faso had caught the moment. Traore slammed the contract shut. Another caught the exact paragraph he read aloud. By the time news of the minister's arrests hit state media, the footage had already gone viral. Within an hour, the country erupted. Crowds gathered outside ministries. Students marched with signs that read, "We read." Market vendors turned up their radios to listen for updates. Retired military officers posted videos online, praising the president's courage. In Boba Lasso, miners rallied, chanting, "Our soil, our rules." No one saw it coming. Not the ministers, not the foreign delegations, not even the citizens themselves. Traore watched from his private office, standing by the window as the streets of Ouagadougou filled. Cars honked in rhythm, flags waved. Young people stood on top of buses, fists raised, not in protest, but in solidarity. He turned to Aminata, who was organizing files for the next cabinet session. How fast did this move? 43 minutes after the arrests. Sire, she said, without looking up. By now, every major outlet has the footage. Social media is calling it the clause that broke the chain. He nodded slowly, and the cabinet splintered. Some are panicking. Some are waiting for direction. He walked to his desk and pulled out a sealed envelope. Then give them direction. It was a letter addressed to the Burkina Faso people, not an official speech, not a press release, just a handwritten statement to be read live that evening in the city square. Outside, loudspeakers began broadcasting emergency updates, but what came through was not fear. It was resolve. This wasn't just a failed deal anymore. It was a reckoning. That night, as two ministers sat in guarded homes without their phones, without their power, the rest of the country lit candles in their windows, not to mourn, but to mark the end of silence. They had been sold once before, not again. It was nearly midnight when the final members of the cabinet entered the high-security meeting room at the presidential palace. The air was heavy, the lights dimmed low. No aides were allowed. No phones. No press. Only ministers. The president. And the truth that was about to change everything. President Traore stood at the head of the long oval table. Not sitting, not smiling. He didn't speak at first. He let the room settle. Let the unease deepen. Ministers exchanged weary glances. No one touched the water bottles in front of them. The empty seats of Finance Minister Dio and Oil Minister Nan loomed like shadows. Then Trio reached for a simple speaker device on the table, pressed a button, and let the first audio recording play. The voice of a Chinese executive echoed through the room, clean and confident. Speaking Mandarin, they don't understand the wording. By the time they realize we'll already have operational control, their ministers are pushing it through fast. We've secured long-term access, maybe indefinite. Another voice followed, Li Jiang's. This is strategic colonization. We don't need soldier. We'll own the infrastructure. Their parliament will never catch it. Gasps rippled down the table. One minister leaned forward, disbelief spreading across his face. Another looked down, refusing to meet Traore's eyes. Still, the president said nothing. He let the tapes speak for themselves. The second recording was worse. Our people will run the oil terminals, not theirs. It's too Risky to trust locals. The agreement gives us jurisdiction if instability arises, and if not, we manufacture instability. We decide what's a threat. A third recording named names. Minister, Dio was reliable. Nan 2. The rest will follow once they see it's already done. When the final file ended, the room was silent. No one moved. Traore stepped away from the table and slowly scanned the faces of his ministers. Some avoided his eyes. Some sat stiff with shame. Few looked ready to speak, but none dared to be first. He let the silence hold a moment longer. Then he spoke calm, sharp. I gave each of you trust. You were not chosen for loyalty to me, but to this nation, and today I discovered that trust has limits. 1. Minister. The Minister of Infrastructure shifted nervously. Mr. President. Some of us were unaware of the depth of these negotiations. We saw the numbers, the investment projections. You saw what they wanted you to see. Traore snapped. And you asked new questions? Another minister, older, more calculating, cleared his throat. Surely we can renegotiate, strip out the clauses, work with Tyne Earth Holdings to repair the agreement. There is no agreement to repair. Traore interrupted. There is an occupation strategy dressed as a partnership. You think they'll rewrite their plan because we asked politely. He turned, pacing slowly along the table. You all sat in meetings. You nodded. Some of you praised the contract's vision. I kept asking, why the rush? Why the silence around appendices? And now we know. You weren't misled. You were comfortable enough to stop thinking. A younger minister finally spoke up. What do you want from us now? Sia, I want your confessions, if you have any. I want the names of consultants, the lobbyists, the shadow meetings you attended outside my office. I want the truth, not to shame you, but to protect what's left of this country's dignity. No one spoke, not for several long seconds. Then the Minister of Energy, hands trembling, reached into his folder and slid forward a document. There was a dinner, he said, in Casablanca. I didn't report it. They promised development aid for power grids. I didn't think it was tied to anything. Military. À moment la terre, the Minister of Trade followed. There were consulting offers. I refused, but I didn't speak up. I didn't want to cause division in the cabinet. Traore nodded slowly, absorbing each word. I don't need perfection, he said. I need courage. If you fail to see this coming, fine. But if you remain silent now, if you stand by while this government becomes a broker of foreign conquest, then you will not sit at this table much longer. He paused, hands on the table, and added, I have no intention of letting foreign men draw new borders in our soil. Using your signatures. Then he straightened. I am forming a sovereign review council effective tonight. Every agreement signed in the last 5 years will be re-examined. If you oppose this, you are free to resign. But if you remain in this room, you will fight with me for our independence, not your careers. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't expect loyalty. He expected clarity. One by one, the ministers nodded. No one left the meeting the same. There was no ceremony, no pre-recorded anthem, no red carpet, just a single desk, a chair, and a man who refused to let his country be sold. The broadcast began at 8:00 p.m. sharp. Across Burkina Faso, televisions flickered on, radios tuned in, phone notifications buzzed. No one knew exactly what the president would say, but everyone felt something was coming. The image was simple. President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone at a wooden desk, sleeves rolled up, eyes steady, no national flag behind him, no military jacket, just the sound of his voice and the weight of the moment. My fellow citizens, he began, his tone measured, but unmistakably resolute. Tonight I speak to you not as a politician, not as a soldier, but as your son, a son of this land, a witness to its pain, a keeper of its promise. He didn't pose for applause. There was no audience in the room, but millions were already leaning in closer to their screens. For weeks, our government has been engaged in negotiations with Tangjin Earth Holdings, a powerful consortium, promising billions in investment. Roads, hospitals, jobs. They told us it was a gift, a partnership, a future. He tapped a thick binder on the desk. The contract. But inside this document, buried on page 186, is the price of that gift. Hidden clauses, terms written in a foreign language, words meant to be missed, words that would have handed control of our rare earth minerals, our oil, and even our military adjacent lands to a foreign power without our consent, without your knowledge. He looked directly into the lens. That is not investment. That is betrayal. Around the country, living rooms went silent. In cafes, shopkeepers turned up the volume. On university campuses, students gathered around radios, some holding each other's hands. Traore's voice hardened. They wanted us to believe it was normal, that giving up 60 kilometers of jurisdiction around each mine was industry standard, that allowing foreign security personnel to operate with immunity on our soil was just part of the deal, that letting the contract renew indefinitely without our say was a technicality. He leaned forward, hands folded. But I was not elected to sell Burkina Faso. I was not handed this flag to see it replaced by corporate logos. We are not for sale. Not to Europe, not to China, not to anyone. The message hit like thunder. Some of your ministers failed you. They took payments. They looked the other way. They said yes when they should have screamed no. 2 of them are now under arrest, and more investigations will follow. In Bobo, Dazzle, a mechanic watching on an old television, let out a loud cheer. In Kaya, a grandmother clapped her hands and shouted. He stood up. In the capital, people flooded the streets, not in protest, but in pride. But this is not just about a bad contract. Trio continued. This is about something deeper, something older. The pattern where others come with smiles, with deals, with promises, and leave with our future. For too long, Africa has been a continent of open veins. We extract, they enrich, we suffer. They saw, he took a breath. No more. The words weren't loud, but they rang like a national anthem. I will not lie to you. Turning down this deal will come at a cost. Projects will be delayed. Pressures will rise. They may try to punish us with embargoes or whispers, but I believe in the strength of this land. I believe in the power of a people who refuse to bow. He lifted the contract again and held it up to the camera. This was not a mistake. It was a trap, and we caught it in time. He placed it down and looked straight into the eyes of the nation. The soil beneath our feet does not belong to investors. It belongs to our children. The oil in our ground is not a shortcut. It is a trust, and our dignity is not negotiable. With that, he ended the speech, not with slogans, but with silence. He stood, nodded once, and walked off camera. The signal cut to black, but across the region, something had already begun. The speech spread instantly. Within the hour, it was translated into French, English, Arabic, and Swahili. West African radio hosts replayed it on loops. Screens in bus terminals and border towns repeated the closing lines over and over. We are not for sale. In Mali, youth groups organized solidarity marches. In Ghana, lawmakers called for a review of their own mineral contracts. In Naya, students chanted in the streets, check your page. Traore didn't just expose a lie. He sparked a movement, and no one could turn away. The backlash came fast. Less than 24 hours after Traore's national address, China issued a formal condemnation. Their embassy in Ouagadougou released a statement accusing Burkina Faso of diplomatic hostility and misinformation, then froze all active and pending investments in infrastructure, energy, and mining. Projects halted mid-construction. Engineers packed up. Contracts were terminated without negotiation. Across the capital, half-built roads sat empty. Shipments of Imported medical equipment were returned. A rural clinic expansion funded through a Chinese health initiative was abruptly abandoned. The materials left stacked by the roadside. So many Stepanik economic forecasts showed a sharp short-term contraction. Local media questioned how the country would survive the sudden vacuum, but Traoré didn't flinch. He called a press meeting, not in a marble hall, but in a dusty open-air courtyard near a crossing alignment community garden in Zenor. There were no teleprompters, only a handheld mic, and his voice. We were offered riches with strings, he said. Now they've cut the slash and strings and expect us to fall, but we were never hanging. We were standing. The message was clear. There would be no backpedaling, no re-entry into talks under duress, and certainly no apology. By the end of the week, Western financial institutions saw an opening, offers poured in from Europe, Washington, and even the World Bank. Packages labeled as emergency recovery plans were presented with speed and polish. The numbers looked generous on paper, but the fine print was all too familiar. High interest rates, vague benchmarks, condition, demanding market liberalization, resource guarantees, and security cooperation. A page-for-page mirror of the same colonial logic, just dressed in new fonts and logos. Traoré met with his cabinet behind closed doors. When one minister cautiously suggested reviewing the Western terms, Traoré didn't raise his voice. He just pointed at the shredded copy of the Tangent Earth Holdings contract sitting in a glass case nearby. I didn't tear up, one leash to wear another. He rejected every offer within days. The narrative shifted. What began as anxiety became resilience. Across the country, ordinary citizens stepped forward, not with complaints, but with solutions. In the city of Kadugu, young engineers from the Peg. National Polytechnic School formed a volunteer coalition. They proposed redesigning rural road plans using local materials and solar-powered tools. Within a week, they mobilized 120 graduates and secured donations of scrap metal, bamboo, and brick from neighborhood workshops. In Vahiguya, farmers and mechanics launched the ZMCO initiative, a grassroots fuel co-op that converted local cooking oil into biodiesel for trucks previously reliant on Chinese imports. Women led the tech production. Teenagers ran distribution. In Tenko, retired electrical engineers began working with students to retrofit old generators into microgrid stations powered by wind and sun. They called it Light for Ourselves. And in Ouagadougou, murals began appearing on public walls. A miner holding a shovel high, a child planting a flag. Next to them in bold painted letters, "We Our Future." It wasn't a campaign, it was a movement. Neighborhoods began organizing cleanup drives. Civil servants volunteered, unpaid overtime. Local businesses introduced barter-based systems for essentials. Musicians released protest. Songs turned empowerment anthems. Students recited Traoré's speech in classrooms like scripture. Foreign media tried to frame it as desperation, but inside the country, something else was blooming. Ownership, not of just land or resources, but of destiny. Meanwhile, in the presidential palace, Traoré received a quiet update from Aminata. "There's been chatter on diplomatic channels," she said. "Some in the EU are confused. They thought we'd cave. They're watching to see if we'll adjust course." He looked out the window where a group of children were walking home from school in uniforms made of faceted fanny, laughing, backpack slung low. "Let them watch," he said. "Let them see what freedom looks like after the cameras are gone." Later that evening, he met with the engineers from Kugu who arrived with charts and notebooks full of sketches for locally built road grading machines. They asked if the government would fund it. He smiled and said, "No, but I'll work beside you and we'll fund it together." They shook hands. No contracts, just commitment. The storm had come. The offers had failed, but Burkina Faso was still standing, taller than before. The call came just after dawn. President Traoré was sipping strong black tea in the garden behind the palace. when his chief of communications stepped out with a secure tablet in hand. "It's from Liz." She said, "You'll want to take it." Trey nodded. Bolivia. It wasn't the first country that came to mind during a national resource crisis. But these days, alliances were no longer shaped by power. They were shaped by principle. He took the call on a private line. The face on the other end was President Luis R. Calm and direct. President Traore already said, "We've been watching the courage your people showed. It's familiar to us." Traore said nothing at Dotland. First, he let the silence speak, then asked, "Are you calling to congratulate us or to help?" RJ smiled. "Both. And not just me. Argentina and Chile are already on board. We have experience refining our own lithium, training engineers, building extraction infrastructure without surrendering our sovereignty. We think your fight is our." In fight, that sentence shifted everything. Within 48 hours, a joint proposal landed in Ouagadougou, not alone, not a demand, but a shared roadmap, the Latin American Lithium Alliance, an emerging partnership built between Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile, offered Burkina Faso joint ventures in refining technology, access to processing equipment blueprints, academic exchanges between universities, and most importantly, no military zones, no security contracts, no profit, skimming middlemen. Your people dig the earth. The proposal said, you should shape what comes out of it. Traore read every word himself, then read it again. It wasn't a handout. It was a handshake. He called an emergency cabinet meeting, not to vote, but to inform. The decision had already been made. We don't need savior, he told them. We need partners who understand what it means to be owned and who choose every day not to be. By the end of the week, a delegation of Latin American engineers, economists, and refinery experts landed at Ouagadougou International Airport. They were greeted not by protocol officers in suits, but by students from the National Technical School holding signs that read sovereignty and solidarity. The welcome was electric, humble, honest. In the days that followed, work began immediately. Bolivian geologists toured the rare earth fields in Tapoa and helped local survey teams design a more sustainable excavation method. Argentine refinery specialists trained Burkina Faso mechanical engineers on low-cost purification systems using clay and recycled water. Chilean software developers collaborated with university coders to install transparent digital tracking for resource exports. There were no press releases, only results. Within 3 weeks, the first mini refinery prototype was operational outside Bobo Dioulasso, built entirely with local labor and equipment sourced through pooled procurement. It was modest but functional. A reporter from a European outlet asked one of the Latin American engineers why they'd come. He smiled and said, "We didn't come to build a refinery. We came to build belief." Meanwhile, in Washington and Brussels, policymakers grew restless. Their usual levers, aid, pressure, international media spin had failed to move the Burkina government. The old playbook wasn't working. Instead, a new alliance was taking shape, quiet, grounded in mutual respect, and fueled by something global capital had never fully understood: dignity. In Ouagadougou, murals began to change. Where once the miner had stood alone with a shovel, now he stood beside another figure, an engineer with a blueprint, and beneath them, the new slogan, "Together we rise from the ground." Traore hosted the Latin American delegation for dinner at a community center, not the palace. The tables were wooden. The food was cooked by neighborhood grandmothers. There were no speeches, just shared laughter, broken translations, and clinking glasses. Afterward, he walked with one of the refinery engineers to the parking lot. "Why?" Trey asked quietly. "You didn't have to come." The engineer shrugged. "Because we've seen what it looks like when you win the resource war, but lose yourself. We won't let you lose. Not like that." Traore looked out across the dark horizon. where the lights of the city flickered with cautious hope. This wasn't just about minerals anymore. It was about rewriting the map of power, and for the first time in generations, the compass wasn't pointing north. It was pointing forward. The morning air was dry, but electric as the first flatbed trucks rumbled through the eastern gate of the resource zone near Tapoa. On them, crates marked with hand-painted stencils, property of the Burkina people. Inside, Watrelingreks, purification tanks, solar generators, and something even more valuable, hope. Construction had officially begun. There were no ribbon-cutting ceremonies, no foreign executives making speeches, just a line of workers in blue coveralls, some still wiping sleep from their eyes, ready to clock in for a job they never thought would belong to them. For decades, drilling meant foreigners, foreign contractors, foreign paychecks, foreign orders. But today, the first bolts were tightened by Burkinab hands. The foreman shouted in Murray and Dula. The flags, flying, weren't for show. They were for pride. The funding had come together quickly, with Chinese capital gone and Western offers rejected. The joint African-South American development funds stepped in. Sago, Ghana, Bolivia, and Chile had all committed funds, not as loans, but as equity partnerships with clauses of full Burkinab control. Small nations pulling what little they had to do something no one expected, build from the inside out. The first phase focused on reclaiming and retooling old colonial pipelines, originally built to carry crude oil to foreground refineries. They were being dismantled piece by piece. Some pipes were sold for probably scrap. Others were melted down to forge parts for new machinery. Welders trained in Ouagadougou worked side by side with engineers from Bolivia and Chile, translating terms, swapping ideas, eating meals on the same benches. At the central site, the hum of equipment filled the air as digging began. But this wasn't extraction. It was transformation. No one understood that better than ISU, a 28-year-old drill operator who had once been a motorcycle taxi driver. Now, after completing a crash training course developed with Argentine engineers, he was leading a 6-person crew. Each morning, he checked the stabilizers, confirmed soil composition, and led safety checks. He no longer begged for fares. He signed payslips. This ground used to belong to ghosts, he said, during a break. Now it answers to us. News of the transformation spread. Quickly, farmers began delivering fresh produce to feed the growing workforce. Students volunteered on weekends to help lay temporary cables and label tools. Women's cooperatives organized laundry and meal stations at the site. The drilling zone didn't feel like a work site. It felt like a village that had finally woken up. President Traoré arrived unannounced on the 10th day. No convoy, no press, just a small team and a pair of dusty boots. When the guards spotted him at the gate, they didn't salute out of protocol. They greeted him like family. He spent hours walking the site, asking workers what they needed, inspecting equipment, and sitting down with teams on their lunch breaks. At one point, a young technician nervously approached him, holding up a design sketch for a new conveyor prototype. Traoré didn't dismiss it. He studied it closely, asked a few questions, and said, "Let's try it." Later, standing on a small hill overlooking the dig zone, he watched the machinery at work and whispered, "This is what liberation sounds like." Amunata, who stood nearby, handed him a folder. Preliminary reports. The new equipment's performing better than projected, and the productivity rate is already 12% higher than under foreign contractors. He nodded, but didn't smile. That's good, but it's not about speed. It's about never giving it back. Down in the pit, the sound of drills echoed, not with the violence of greed, but the rhythm of purpose. Dust flew, sparks danced, and with every foot of earth uncovered, the myth that Burkina Faso needed to be managed by outsiders crumbled a little more. That afternoon, a group of school children were given a tour of the site. They wore little yellow hard hats and carried notebooks. A teacher explained how the mineral purification process worked. One girl asked if this meant they'd be rich now. No, the teacher said gently, but it means we decide what richness means. Nearby, a sign was erected at the edge of the site. Simple, unpainted, hand-carved into wood. First Barona Bound, resource facility built by us, for us. The wind picked up, the flag flapped, loud, and beneath the soil, the ground turned, not just because of the drills, but because of a people who had finally chosen to dig for themselves. It started quietly, too quietly to be coincidence. One morning, a transformer near the outskirts of Ouagadougou failed without warning. Hours later, another blackout rolled through Kudu. Within days, 5 regional power nodes had collapsed, all of them feeding electricity to the new construction zones tied to Burkina Faso's resource independence effort. At first, it looked like poor maintenance, but Aminata knew better. She stood in the central command center, inside the Ministry of Energy, scanning time-stamped logs. Every system that failed had been digitally accessed within minutes of shutting down, not from local IPs, but through foreign relays routed from servers in Dubai and Singapore. The pattern was too surgical, too deliberate. They're not attacking our lights, she told Traore that night, placing a tablet on his desk. They're targeting morale, infrastructure, momentum. These are strategic hits. But the grid wasn't the only target. In the northern province of Yaga, 3 community-owned grain silos were burned to the ground. Firefighters arrived too late. Locals whispered about masked men fleeing into the bush, speaking in French and broken Murray. The same week, new equipment arriving from Latin America was intercepted and vandalized. Along an unmarked road, no group claimed responsibility, but the damage was done. Then came the protests. At first, small gatherings, angry voices with vague complaints, delayed salaries, lack of foreign investment, broken promises. But the signs they carried were too polished, the slogans too well coordinated. Many were in English, aimed at international media. Drones flew, overhead recording, images. Hashtags trended instantly in Europe and the US. Burkina fails at mining. Disaster should bring back stability. Try recognize the fingerprints. For mere loyalists, ministers, advisors, even mid-level bureaucrats, removed during the contract fallout, hadn't disappeared. They'd gone underground, and now they were stirring chaos for the cameras. This isn't resistance, he said grimly, during a late-night briefing. It's theater and someone's writing the script from abroad. But Burkina Faso was not unarmed. As soon as the first sabotage wave hit, students at the National Polytechnic launched Project Moaga, a decentralized system of mobile generators and wireless mesh networks to bypass power outages. Farmers in Utena formed neighborhood defense circles, patrolling granaries and seed banks at night with radios and motorcycles. In Bobodaso, women's groups organized food reserves and trained volunteers in basic infrastructure repair. They called themselves the Daughters of Resilience. Their mottos spread like wildfire. They burn, we rebuild. Meanwhile, Aminata worked around the clock with the newly formed Cyber Integrity Task Force. What she uncovered stunned everyone. Buried deep inside a dormant software update once used by the Ministry of Commerce was a backdoor, a tiny code string disguised as a formatting tool. It allowed outside actors to access internal communications, override shipment routes, and leak key project plans to unknown third parties. The origin traced back to a private French telecom contractor who had once handled IT infrastructure for Burkina Faso's customs network. That contract had been quietly terminated 2 years ago, but the backdoor had remained. We were bleeding information before we even started building. Aminata told they knew every supply route, every schedule. He didn't explode. He sat still for a long moment, then asked, "Can we shut them out?" "We already have," she said. "The code's been neutralized. But the real risk now is narrative. They're not trying to beat us on the ground. They're trying to beat us in the headlines. He stood, walked to the window. The city beyond was quiet, but flickers of candlelight dotted the horizon. Homes leak without power. Neighbors sharing flame. They want our people to believe this is failing. He said, we can't just protect the buildings. We have to protect the belief. That evening, a nationwide emergency broadcast went live. Not from a studio, but from the drilling site in Tapoa. With workers behind him, Traore stood under the open sky and addressed the nation. There are those who want us to go back to begging, who burn our food so we crawl, who cut our wires so we stay silent. But they misunderstand something. He pointed to the workers behind him. We have never needed permission to rise. Within hours, community militias formed legally under local jurisdictions to defend key sites. Student tech teams secured servers and launched citizen-run information platforms. The sabotage continued, but every act was met with twice the resolve. In the shadows, enemies pulled strings, but in the daylight, the people built, guarded, rose, and in every corner of the country, the whisper became a roar. We dig our future and we defend it. The courtroom was no longer a room. It had been moved outside to the National Plaza in Ouagadougou beneath a clouded sky and flanked by rows of citizens, elders, youth leaders, and local journalists. What began as a legal proceeding had become something far greater. This was not just about crime. It was about truth. And the people had come not to spectate, but to bear witness. President Traore had insisted the tribunal be public, unfiltered, and broadcast across the nation. No edits, no censors, just voices, faces, and facts. In the days leading up to it, the square was fortified, but open, giant. Screens were mounted for rural towns. Schools canceled classes. Radios ran special coverage across the country. Anticipation buzzed like electricity in a storm. Aminata took the stand first. She didn't speak like a politician. She didn't carry notes. She began with a single sentence. The sabotage began the price. Moment. We said no. Her testimony was meticulous. She walked the tribunal through intercepted messages, surveillance footage, and evidence trails. She named names and former officials, consultants, foreign liaison. Every claim was backed by documents. Every accusation was followed by silence. The public gasped as recordings played. Disgraced officials whispering about manipulating protests, routing money through offshore accounts, triggering outages to create panic. Some of the voices had once made public pledges of loyalty beside the president himself. When it was time for the accused to speak, most remained defiant at first. Former oil minister Ouattara denied all involvement, citing miscommunication. I served the republic, he said, not foreign interests, but the documents told a different story. Wire transfer, secret flights, deleted memos recovered by Aminata's team. The moment that broke, the tension came 3 hours in when Minister Ka was called forward. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't look up. The judge asked, do you deny the charges of conspiracy, corruption, and undermining state sovereignty? Minister Dio shook his head slowly. I don't deny them, he said, but I want to explain. The judge allowed it. Dio stepped forward. His voice cracked, not with theatrics, but something deeper. I believed we couldn't do it. He began, that we weren't strong enough to stand alone, that we needed the big powers, China, France, anyone. I thought a few hidden clauses were worth the price of getting schools built, roads, jobs. He turned toward the crowd. I was wrong. You could hear the wind move through the plaza. They offered me money and I took it. I told myself it was for the good of the country, but I see now, I didn't believe independence was possible. I didn't believe in us. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth. A boy whispered to his grandfather. He's crying. Dio's eyes filled, but he kept speaking. President Traore believed, even when we mocked him, even when we tried to stop him, and he was right. The judge didn't interrupt. When Dio sat down, head bowed, no one clapped, no one cheered. The weight of his words pressed down on the nation like thunderclouds. One by one, the remaining defendants gave their testimonies. Some wept, some remained stone-faced. A few confessed to being threatened by foreign investors, blackmailed, bribed, or simply afraid. But the pattern was clear. They had sold doubt in a country trying to believe in itself. The verdicts were announced before sundown. Sentences ranged from asset seizures and removal from public life to years in community rehabilitation programs. No one was executed. No one was exiled. But no one walked away unaccountable. Traore addressed the nation that night, not from the palace, but from the tribunal itself. His voice was calm but unshakable. Justice is not vengeance, he said. It's light. It's what lets us see where we went wrong so we can walk forward without tripping again. The sky rumbled as he spoke, clouds beginning to churn. Then, as if timed by history itself, thunder cracked overhead. The plaza did not scatter. They stood. They let the rain fall. That night, water washed over, a country reclaiming itself. And the people didn't run. They lifted their faces to the storm. It was early morning when the encrypted call came through. President Traore had just returned from a village visit in the southern region, where school children presented him with drawings of drills, tractors, and maps, each one labeled our soil, our strength. He hadn't made it past the front hall of the palace when his chief of staff approached. Tablet in Hunt, president of Congo-Brazzaville, is on the secure line, she said. He says it's urgent. Traore nodded and stepped into his private office. The door shut behind him. He tapped the screen and the line connected. President Traore, came the voice, steady but heavy with tension. I hope I'm not intruding. Never. Traore replied. What's happened? There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end continued. We've reviewed a recent draft of our oil contract with Panacea Petro Group. The language felt familiar. My aides brought me a clause buried in the annex. It grants indefinite security jurisdiction around the pipeline, automatic renewal during undefined emergencies. Page 143. My legal team missed it. Traore closed his eyes and exhaled. You found your own version of our page 168. Yes, President McCrory said, and I need to know what comes after. We've already signed a preliminary SALT. My cabinet is divided. Some say we can't afford to walk away. Others to watching you. Traore leaned forward in his chair, voice calm. Walking away doesn't collapse a country, but selling your name does. And that's what these contracts are doing. They're erasing the names of our nations from our own soil. I'm not sure we can survive the fallout. McCrory admitted. They'll pull out, cut funding, isolate us. You made it through. But can we? You're asking the parter. Wrong question. Traore said. It's not whether you survive without them. It's whether your people survive what they leave behind. They don't just take minerals. They take memory, authority, time. And McCrory was quiet. Then he asked almost softly, how did you know? To look deeper. Traore thought back to that dinner. To Li Jiang's cold smile. To Aminata's urgent whisper. Then to the night spent reading appendices under flickering lights. While most of his government slept, I didn't, he said. But I had people around me who refused to be comfortable. And I listened. Another pause. And once the pressure came, McCrory asked, they froze our funds. They triggered blackouts. They planted unrest, but our people didn't fold. They built solar generators. They formed food cooperatives. The West offered new contracts with the same old chains. We said new again. McCrory chuckled. But it carried no more. You make it sound simple. It wasn't, Traore said. It broke things. Friends. Institutions. But it gave us one thing back. He paused. Control. On the other end, the Congol's president sighed. What should I tell my cabinet? Tell them to read every word twice in your language, not theirs. And tell them this. True wealth isn't in the contract. It's in who controls the pen. The words landed across the ocean of silence between them. Something shifted. I may ask to send a delegation to Ouagadougou, Macquarie said, to study your frameworks, meet your engineers, learn what the headlines don't tell. You're welcome anytime, Traore said, but tell your people the truth. Not just about the danger, but about the dignity in refusing. That afternoon, Traore gathered his core team, Aminata, Defense Minister, Colonel Bako, the new Finance Minister, representatives from the cooperatives, university leaders. They sat around a long table, not for ceremony, but for design. He laid out a new plan, a regional legal fellowship where African law students could be trained specifically in mining and contract law. Another initiative for publishing all the natural resource agreements online for public review, and a Pan-African drafting body open source to build standardized sovereignty-focused trade templates. Or else they used outside in the streets of Ouagadougou. Murals began to change again. One showed a child handing a pen to a farmer. Another showed an elder holding torn contracts in one hand and seeds in the... And beneath them, one message began to spread across chalkboards, radio waves, and mouths. We control the pen now. And that was how refusal became power. Not just for Burkina Faso, but for anyone watching, anyone reading, anyone daring to ask. What's on page 186? The chandeliers glimmered above polished marble. Flags lined the walls. Nameplates marked each nation's position. Along a U-shaped table, interpreters waited in booths. Photographers circled like moths. This was the China-Africa Economic Advancement Summit held in Addis Ababa, and the air buzzed with rehearsed optimism, but one chair stood out. Burkina Faso's seat, front row, center left, sat untouched. The microphone unplugged. The flag folded neatly in its slot. No delegation, no diplomat, just silence. When asked about the absence, a senior Chinese organizer offered a tight-lipped response, scheduling conflict. But by mid-morning, everyone knew that wasn't true. Traore hadn't come late. He hadn't come at all. Inside the media gallery, a Ghanaian journalist posted a single sentence to social media. They didn't show up to sign. They showed up to, I think. The post went viral in minutes. Across the room, other delegations noticed. Eyes drifted toward the empty seat, more than the ones that were filled. Some whispered, some smirked, others watched with quiet respect. The opening address came from China's vice premier, who spoke at length about partnership, prosperity, and long-term cooperation. His words were precise, measured, but the undertone was clear. There was tension now. The old formula money plus different cents was beginning to crack because Burkina Faso had done the unthinkable. They had said no, publicly, repeatedly, and survived. And the ripples were reaching every corner of the continent. In the days before the summit, delegations from Namibia, Senegal, and Sierra Leone had quietly requested legal reviews of their mining agreements. A representative from the delegates filed into the conference halls one by one, their footsteps muffled against polished marble floors. Each carried two versions of the same contract, one in English, the other in Mandarin, and none of them looked eager to speak first. In hushed tones, phrases bounced from group to group: resource protection corridors, emergency jurisdiction, automatic renewal. But over every whispered conversation hovered a single question: what lurked on page 186? The story had already spread across capitals. A single refusal by President Ibrahim Traoré had rippled outward like a stone tossed into still water. At every summit and seminar, ministers asked each other the same quiet question: what's on your page 186? Even the most loyal allies of China hesitated before answering, their body language betraying the first flicker of doubt. For the first time, contracts weren't just documents. They were tests of courage. Zambia's delegation was quick to capitalize. With quiet pride, they announced a new initiative for contract transparency. Nigeria suggested that all resource agreements be ratified in parliament before signatures touched paper. Subtle as a heartbeat, a shift was unfolding. Leaders were no longer asking how much they could gain. They were beginning to ask what they might be giving away. Back in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's decision was met with calm resolve rather than anger. Traoré had explained it simply to his advisors. This isn't a boycott. It's a message. You don't need to sit at a table if the meal has been poisoned. Instead of attending, Burkina Faso hosted its own summit during the same week. It was smaller, humbler, yet somehow more electric. Held in the modest hall of a public university, the summit brought together engineers, law students, economists, and regional leaders from 6 African nations and 3 Latin American countries. The seating was in formal circles rather than rows. Chalkboards replaced projectors. The theme wasn't investment, it was authorship. Burkina Faso revealed every detail of its contract audit framework, annotated translations, public legal glossaries, step-by-step training kits for municipalities. Everything was open source, freely given. No one needed to ask permission. This isn't knowledge to hoard. Amunata, one of the lead organizers, told the attendees. It's a trap meant to diffuse power, not concentrate it. Applause erupted, loud and spontaneous. Meanwhile, in Addis Ababa, the official photo op at the international summit had to be postponed. Rumors spread that multiple heads of delegation refused to stand on the same stage. Behind closed doors, Chinese negotiators shifted their tone less rigid, less commanding. New templates were offered. Language softened. Military clauses were trimmed. But the truth was already clear. African leaders had heard something they could not unhear. Freedom, it seemed, had a new vocabulary. It was legal. It was contractual. And it had a face. A president who left his seat deliberately empty. By the end of the summit, China's delegation released a carefully worded statement emphasizing mutual respect and evolving partnership models. No one mentioned Burkina Faso by name, but every attendee knew exactly what had happened. Every silent chair carried a story. Every quiet absence a lesson. Across Africa, conversations shifted. Leaders stopped asking, "What's the offer?" They began asking, "What's the cost?" The message had transcended the summit halls. In the weeks that followed, journalists, students, and ministers alike shared a simple refrain. Page 186. It became shorthand for vigilance, for the courage to question, for the refusal to hand over sovereignty on paper. Then came the Tapoa rare earth refinery. The first school tours were unforgettable. Children in slightly oversized yellow hard hats stepped from buses. Uniforms creased, eyes wide, mouths half open in astonishment. This was the continent's first refinery entirely owned and operated by local hands. Conveyors hummed beneath solar-paneled roofs. Technicians in navy jumpsuits, names stitched in thread across their chests, monitored gauges with quiet pride. At the heart of the tour, a 10-year-old boy asked question after question. What does this lever do? How hot does that chamber get? Why does the liquid glow purple? The guide, a former student of the same local school, answered patiently, letting curiosity lead the lesson. Finally, they reached the last corridor. A mural stretched across the wall, depicting red earth, golden veins of minerals. Farmers standing shoulder to shoulder with engineers. Below it, in bold letters, the message was simple and startling. No foreign soil under our feet. No foreign chains on our wrists. The boy lingered, staring. Then, slowly, he asked the question that stilled the group. Who owns this? The guide did not flinch. You do, he said. You, your classmates, your parents, your future children. Every part of this belongs to the people who stayed, who worked, who refused to sell. For a long moment, the boy did not speak again. Then his posture changed. He straightened, chest out, eyes bright with understanding. Behind him, his teacher dabbed at her eyes, surprised by the lump in her throat. Outside the factory, more buses arrived, students, engineers, and trade representatives from neighboring countries and Latin America poured in, not merely to learn technology, but to witness the spirit behind it. The refinery wasn't just a building. It was a statement. President Traore arrived quietly that afternoon. No press, no speeches, no ceremonial fanfare. He walked along the production line, nodding to workers, listening to engineers, making notes in the margins of his notebook. At the purification chamber, he watched a freshly processed sample stamped with the new national certification. Origin Burkina Faso. Ownership 100% local. A technician noticed him watching. "We just hit 90% efficiency," she said. Traore smiled faintly. "It's never about the equipment. It's about who believes in it." Later, in a small break room, he listened as shift supervisors and engineers proposed a technical college and a village investment fund powered by refinery profits. Traore didn't take notes. He simply said, "Make it happen. I'll back you." The refinery, now more than a mineral processing facility, was generating vision, pride, and direction. Across Ouagadougou, state television ran a modest feature on the refinery. No flashy graphics, just glimpses of daily life. Local workers, deliveries, bicycle lanes being paved with refinery support. The screen faded to a single quote, "We didn't wait for permission. We built. It was enough." Months passed, and the hum of the Tapoa refinery became a rhythm in the city of Ouagadougou. Children rode bicycles along roads lit by locally built solar grids, and the once cracked streets stitched villages to the capital. Markets thrived as small vendors set up stalls, selling produce and handmade goods, their profits no longer siphoned away by distant companies. Across the continent, Traore's Kiet defiance became a blueprint. In Ghana, lawmakers demanded audits of every foreign mining contract, poring over each clause with lawyers who had never previously been involved in economic decision-making. University students organized contract literacy teach-ins, learning to read the fine print of agreements that could shape their futures. In Namibia, a president cited Burkina Faso's approach in a speech on energy independence, signaling a shift in how nations viewed their own resources. Meanwhile, the Tapoa refinery continued to evolve. Engineers proposed a small adjacent technical college. Villagers asked for solar connections powered by refinery profits. Supervisors sketched out plans for microloans to farmers. Traore did not dictate. He simply encouraged, listened, and then left the initiative in local hands. The factory was no longer just a plant, it was a living map of autonomy. Within the refinery's walls, a sense of ownership had taken root. Workers spoke openly about improvements, suggesting tweaks to conveyor speeds or new safety measures. Even minor decisions felt significant because they were theirs to make. A new generation of technicians, raised in Burkina Faso, began to see the world differently. Their labor translated directly into prosperity for their communities. Outside, the symbol of the empty chair at the China-Africa Summit had transformed into a cultural touchstone. Murals depicting that silent space began appearing in local schools and government offices. Citizens started referring to it as the chair of principle. Conversations shifted from money and foreign investment to rights, responsibility, and accountability. And then there were the letters. On the anniversary of Traore's refusal to sign, school children across the country wrote one-page letters to their future selves, documenting what they wanted to protect, what they refused to give away, and how they envisioned Burkina Faso in 20 years. Each letter was unique. Some were simple, scrawled in crayon, others meticulous in pen. These letters were displayed in rotating exhibits at the Sovereignty Hall, the museum, formerly a colonial archive. The museum became a pilgrimage site of sorts. Families visited to see not only the letters of children, but also the preserved contracts, photographs, and the very chair Traore had left empty. The centerpiece, however, remained. The simple note he had never officially signed. "I did not reject China. I rejected chains with ink on them. Our minerals are valuable, but our dignity is priceless." Visitors often lingered, reading the words again and again, sensing how something so small could carry so much weight. Diplomats from foreign countries came and left without comment, aware that no media statement could capture what these 4 sentences conveyed. The effects weren't limited to Burkina Faso. In Congo-Brazzaville, the new president referenced Traore's note in his inaugural speech. "If the soil is ours, so too must be the words written upon it." Small nations in the Sahel and West Africa began auditing, renegotiating, or even walking away from contracts that compromised sovereignty. Cooperative-based refineries sprang up in Mali, Niger, and Benin. Across borders, a new currency was circulating. Not gold, nor oil, but self-respect and legal awareness. Back in Ouagadougou, ordinary citizens began taking pride in their agency. Farmers demanded transparency in agreements with buyers. Local councils insisted on public discussions before permits were issued. Students practiced reading contracts for practice, sometimes debating clauses late into the evening. Where once foreign oversight had dictated action, now local communities were learning to negotiate, to question, to decide. The boy from the Tepoa tour had grown a few inches taller. He still visited the refinery, notebook in hand, asking questions that challenged even experienced engineers. Each answer he received became a spark. Ownership isn't just about what you hold in your hands. One supervisor explained, it's about what you understand, what you protect, and what you pass on. The boy nodded. Years from now, he would be ready to pass it on. And so the story of Burkina Faso became a living lesson, unfolding day by day, year by year. Leadership had left no monument, no statue, no plaque, with Traore's name engraved in gold. Instead, it had left a nation that believed in its own decisions, a people confident in their knowledge and their rights, and a new generation raised to ask the right question. Who owns this? Because in the end, it wasn't the refinery that mattered most, nor the contracts, nor the letters. It was the conviction to say no when saying yes meant change. That simple, quiet refusal had created a wave small at first, but unstoppable, reaching every corner of a continent long told it could not thrive without someone else's permission. And somewhere in Ouagadougou, the boy paused in the refinery courtyard, looked up at the humming solar panels, and smiled. For the first time, he knew the land beneath his feet truly belonged to him, and to everyone who refused to hand it away.